The last light in the office on the 42nd floor went out at 3:17 a.m., not because anyone had left, but because the automatic timer decided it was time. Rafael Monteiro stood in the dark for a few seconds before realizing it. He was sitting in the Italian leather chair that cost more than the annual salary of anyone who cleaned that building, and he was looking at the reflection of the city through the window as if trying to find something among the illuminated buildings, something that would justify staying there, something that would justify continuing. At 43, Rafael owned a fortune most people couldn't spend in 5 lifetimes. 3 companies, 2 apartments in São Paulo, a house in Lisbon he never visited, and a collection of watches he wore on a rotating basis, as if each day of the week required a different weight on his wrist. But that morning, the watch was on the table, and his wrist was bare. And he looked at the pill bottle next to the glass of whiskey with the same nonchalance one might have for a house key, as if it were just the next door to open. Nobody knew. Nobody suspected. Rafael smiled at meetings, shook hands firmly, closed deals elegantly. When someone asked how he was, the answer was always the same: busy, but well. And people believed it because rich people aren't allowed to suffer. Rich people don't have the right to sadness. The pain of those who have money is treated as a whim, and Rafael learned that early enough to never complain about anything again. His wife left him 2 years ago, not for another man, not for money. She simply said, one Sunday morning, that she couldn't stand living with someone who was present in every room but absent at all times. Rafael didn't argue. He didn't ask for a chance. He just nodded and continued reading the newspaper, because that's what he knew how to do. Continue. Without feeling, without reacting, without breaking. The son, Lucas, was 19 years old and lived with his mother. He no longer called. He didn't send messages. The last time they spoke, Lucas said a phrase that stuck in Rafael's throat like a thorn that no amount of water could wash down. "You're the kind of father you only miss when you need money, and I don't need it anymore." Rafael kept that phrase like one keeps a bullet in their pocket. He carried it with him everywhere. He slept with it. He woke up with it. And that morning it was there again, repeating itself in the silence of the dark office while the pills waited beside the glass. He stood up. He put on his jacket. He took the elevator to the ground floor. He didn't take his cell phone. He didn't take his wallet. He only took his body because it was the only thing that still seemed to belong to him, although even that he wasn't sure of anymore. It was raining in São Paulo that night. A fine, steady rain, the kind that makes no sound but soaks everything. Rafael wandered aimlessly through the downtown streets. The traffic lights flashed yellow. Homeless people slept under awnings with blankets that looked like they were made of neglect. He passed by them all without looking. Not out of malice, out of habit. People like Rafael have been trained not to see what's on the ground. Their world happens from the waist up, at meeting tables, on rooftops, on airplanes. But then he heard. First it was a murmur, then a melody, then a voice that seemed to come from within the rain itself, as if the water had learned to sing. Rafael stopped, not by choice, but by instinct. Something in that voice pierced his jacket, his shirt, his skin, his bones, and touched a place inside him that he thought had already died. She was sitting on the step of a closed church. Her wet hair clung to her face, a coat that was too big for her, torn at the left sleeve, her bare feet on the damp concrete. And she sang. She sang with her eyes closed, as if the music were the only thing protecting her from the rain, as if, while she sang, nothing could hurt her. Rafael stood about 10 meters away. He didn't approach, he just listened. The music was old, a song he didn't recognize, but which seemed to know him. It spoke of a river that carries away the things we hold on to too tightly. It spoke of open hands and letting go. It spoke of light in places where no one looks. When the woman opened her eyes, she saw Rafael standing in the rain, soaked like her, and showed neither fear nor surprise. She simply looked at him as if he were just another part of the landscape, just another wet man in a city where it never stops raining. "Nice music," he said. And his own voice sounded strange, as if he'd forgotten how to talk to someone without a goal, without an agenda, without a contract. She didn't answer immediately. She pulled her coat closer to her body and looked out at the empty street. "My mother used to sing this song when she was washing clothes in the tub. I was little, and I would sit on the floor of the laundry area listening. I thought it was the most beautiful voice in the world." "And was it?" "It was. Until the day she stopped singing." Rafael didn't ask why. He didn't need to. There are silences that tell entire stories, and that was one of them. He sat on the step next to her without asking permission, without calculating the distance. His 6,000 real jacket brushed against the dirty concrete, and he didn't notice, or he didn't care. Her name was Celina. She was 38 years old, though her face bore the marks of a life that seemed to have lasted twice as long. She asked Rafael for nothing. She didn't reach out her hand. She didn't tell her story as if begging for pity. She simply stood there, sharing the step and the rain with a stranger who seemed as lost as she was. In the following days, Rafael returned. always in the early morning, always without his cell phone, wallet, or watch. He would walk to the church in the center of town and sit on the same step. Sometimes Celina was there, sometimes not. When she was, they spoke little. Short sentences, long silences. He discovered that she slept sometimes there, sometimes in a municipal shelter 6 blocks away. That she had once had a house, a husband, a daughter. That her daughter died at the age of 4 from a fever that the public hospital took too long to treat. That her husband left afterward because the pain of losing a child splits people in two and each half goes its own way. That Celina was left with the half that could no longer walk. She didn't tell everything at once. It was in pieces. Crumbs of a life that she carefully distributed, like someone sharing their last loaf of bread. And Rafael listened. For the first time in years, he listened to someone. Not to answer, not to solve anything, not to close a deal, just to listen. One night, Celina asked him what he was doing there, a man in a fine suit, standing in the rain, sitting on the floor of a church, talking to a woman the whole world pretends doesn't exist. Rafael thought for a long time before answering. The light rain continued to fall. A skinny dog crossed the street without haste. "I came here to give up," he said, "but then I heard you sing." Celina looked at him with an attention that no one had shown Rafael in years. It wasn't pity, it wasn't curiosity, it was recognition. The look of someone who knows the exact weight of despair and can identify it in others. Give up on what? Everything. She didn't say life was beautiful. She didn't say everything would get better. She didn't offer ready-made phrases that fit in decorative frames in waiting rooms. Instead, he started singing again. Softly, the same song, the one about the river that carries things away, the one about open hands. And Rafael felt his eyes burn in a way he hadn't felt since he was a boy, since the last time he cried in the lap of his grandmother who was no longer alive. He wept, there, on the church steps, in the rain, next to a woman who had nothing and who, precisely for that reason, wasn't afraid to be near someone who was going through hardship. Because people who have a lot always run from the pain of others. They're afraid it's contagious. But those who have lost everything know that pain isn't contagious. Pain is shared. And shared, it weighs less. Rafael didn't return to the office the next day, nor the day after. On the third morning, his secretary called the cell phone that had been abandoned in the drawer, and the call rang in the emptiness of the triplex apartment that smelled of stale coffee and loneliness. The partners sent messages. The lawyers were nervous. The financial market waits for no one, and Rafael Monteiro's absence began to generate rumors. But he was somewhere else. He was sitting on a park bench, sharing a vending machine coffee with Celina, listening to her talk about how she learned to sing from her mother, how music was the only inheritance no one could take from her, how she sang on buses for coins, and how people turned their faces away, pretending the sound didn't exist, that she didn't exist, that beauty can't be born from a dirty body and torn clothes. He listened to her and saw in her everything he had lost in himself. The ability to exist without needing to prove anything, the courage to be alive without an official reason, the dignity that is independent of a suit, a position, a bank balance. Celina had nothing, and yet she was more whole than anyone he knew. It was Celina who, unknowingly, brought him back. Not with advice, not with motivational inspiration, but with her presence, with the simple and rare willingness to be by someone's side without wanting anything in return. Rafael began to understand that the life he had built was a perfect building on the outside and completely empty on the inside. Each floor was an achievement he hadn't celebrated. Each room was a relationship he hadn't cultivated. Each window was a view he had never stopped to look at. 2 weeks later, Rafael made a decision. Not grand, not cinematic, just necessary. He called his partners and proposed selling his share in the companies. He called his son and didn't say anything important, just asked how he was, and listened to the silence on the other end like someone listening to a sad song that needs to be heard to the end. He called his ex-wife and apologized, not for the marriage, but for all the mornings he was there without really being there, for all the dinners where his body sat at the table, but his soul remained in the office. With the money from the sale, he bought a simple property on a tree-lined street in an old neighborhood, not for himself, to transform it into a space where people like Celina could have shelter, food, and something that no social program offers, a place to sing. A place where the voice of someone the world ignores could be heard without haste, without judgment, without coins thrown on the ground as a shameful alms. Celina didn't accept immediately. She was suspicious. People who spend years being treated as invisible develop a shell that doesn't break through with easy kindness. She felt there was a hidden agenda, a quid pro quo, fine print in the contract. Because no one, ever, in her entire life, had offered something without wanting something in return. "What do you want from me?" she asked one day, standing in the doorway of the property, arms crossed and with the hard look of someone who had been deceived too many times. "I want you to sing," he said. "Not for me, not for anyone. For you." She didn't answer that day, nor the next. On the third day, she appeared at the door with a plastic bag containing the few things she had. She entered unceremoniously, looked at the empty space, walked to the window overlooking a yard with an old mango tree, and began to cry. She cried like someone who hadn't cried in years. She cried for everything she had lost, for her daughter, for her husband, for her house, for her mother who had stopped singing, for all the nights sleeping in the cold, for all the mornings waking up without knowing why. And Rafael stood there at the door, saying nothing, just there, as she had stood there for him on that first rainy night. The space got its name months later, Casa Raiz, root house. Not because someone had the brilliant idea for the name, but because Celina, while planting a jasmine seedling in the backyard, said that every person needs a root to flourish, and Rafael wrote the phrase down on a napkin and never lost it again. Other invisible faces began to arrive there. A man who played the guitar and slept under an overpass, a pregnant teenager who had run away from home, a former music teacher whom alcohol had turned into a shadow, people whom the city had swallowed and forgotten to return. And Celina sang for all of them. Sometimes her mother's song, sometimes other songs, sometimes songs that no one knew, that seemed to be born right there in that moment, as if the pain of each person present gave it lyrics and melody. Rafael worked behind the scenes. He cooked, cleaned, dealt with paperwork, answered the phone. Not as a benefactor, not as a rich, nice guy who stepped down from his pedestal to take a picture, as someone who finally found a reason to use his hands for something that matters. The son called on a Thursday night. Lucas, his voice hesitant, full of riddles and silences. He said his mother had told him about the move. He said he thought it was strange. He said he didn't understand. And then he said, almost in a whisper, that he wanted to visit. Rafael gripped the phone tightly and replied simply, "Come." Lucas arrived on a Saturday. He stopped at the door of Casa Raiz with his hands in his pockets and the expression of someone who wants to judge but can't, because what he's seeing is too real to be dismissed with cynicism. He saw the father in an apron, serving soup to an old man who was trembling. He saw Celina sitting on a bench in the yard, teaching the pregnant teenager to sing a lullaby. He saw the jasmine in bloom. He saw people laughing, people who had nothing and yet still laughed. When Rafael saw him at the door, he didn't run to hug him. He just smiled. A small, tired, genuine smile. The kind of smile that isn't rehearsed. Lucas came in, sat at the table, and ate the soup his father served. They didn't say much, but when Lucas left at the door, they hugged. An awkward, crooked hug, too tight, like all hugs that come after an absence that's too long. And neither of them let go first. Months passed. Rafael lost weight, gained new wrinkles, and let his beard grow in a way his former partners wouldn't recognize. Celina gained weight, cut her hair, and now sang with a voice that held less pain and more grounding. They didn't become a couple, although the entire neighborhood was certain they would. What existed between them was something else, something nameless, but felt when two people save each other without planning, without expecting anything in return, without making promises. One night, sitting in the backyard of Casa Raiz under the mango tree that was already bearing fruit, Celina looked at Rafael and said the simplest and most devastating thing anyone had ever said to her. "You heard me sing. No one had ever stopped to listen before." Rafael looked at her and understood that the phrase wasn't about music. It was about existing, about being noticed, about the small and immense miracle of someone stopping amidst their own pain to acknowledge the pain of another. He heard her sing, and in hearing her, he learned to listen to himself, that part of him that had been screaming for years within the silence of expensive offices and empty apartments. The rain returned that night, fine, steady, just like the first time. Celina began to sing, her mother's song, the song of the river that carries things away, and Rafael closed his eyes and let the water fall on his face, without wiping it away, without protecting himself, without running away. For the first time in many years, he didn't want to be anywhere else. For the first time, that was enough.